The morning light filtered through their bedroom blinds in thin stripes, painting their daily routine in bars of gold and shadow. Dr. Sarah Chen noticed the mint on Thomas's lips before anything else, a sharp, unfamiliar freshness that made her pause mid-kiss. After 8 years of marriage, she'd grown accustomed to the taste of his usual cinnamon toothpaste. "You switched brands," she said, pulling back with a questioning smile. Thomas ran his fingers through his already messy dark hair, a habit that had survived from his college days. "The store was out of the regular stuff," he explained, adjusting his yellow safety vest. "Thought I'd try something new. Living dangerously, right?" His eyes crinkled at the corners when he grinned, crow's feet deeper now at 36 than when they'd first met. Sarah smoothed down his collar, a ritual she performed countless times. The fabric was worn soft at the edges. He'd refused to replace this particular shirt, claiming it was his lucky one. "Just don't live too dangerously today. That new high-rise project of yours is getting tall enough to make me nervous," says the woman who literally holds people's lives in her hands every day. Thomas caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Speaking of which, big surgery today?" "Just a routine appendectomy. In and out in 45 minutes, if everything goes smoothly." She glanced at her watch, a Tudor black bay he'd given her for their 5th anniversary. "Which it better, because I'm making that chicken pasta you like for dinner. The one with the sun-dried tomatoes." His face lit up like a child promised ice cream. "Now I'm definitely coming home on time." As they walked to their cars, his dusty pickup truck and her sensible Volvo, Thomas pulled out his phone. "Hold on, babe. Let me get a picture of you in your scrubs. You look particularly fashionable today, like a very chic garbage bag." Sarah struck an exaggerated pose, making her best runway face. "Only you would dare compare your wife's surgical attire to trash wear." The camera clicked, capturing her mid-laugh. "I'll show this to the guys of the site. Proof that I married way above my pay grade." He sent the photo to her phone immediately, another of their little habits. They'd started doing it years ago, sharing moments throughout the day, building a digital scrapbook of their ordinary life. At Metropolitan Hospital, Sarah showed the picture to her surgical team as they prepared for the day's procedures. Nurse Jackie Wong, her friend of 6 years, rolled her eyes affectionately. "That man of yours has no filter." "That's why I married him," Sarah replied, pulling on her surgical gloves with practiced precision. "He makes every day feel less." She gestured at the sterile surroundings, the gleaming instruments, the harsh fluorescent lights. "Clinical." The operating room hummed with pre-surgery activity. Her anesthesiologist, Dr. Patel, ran through his checklist while surgical nurses arranged instruments in their precise patterns. Sarah studied her patient's chart one final time. Michael Walsh, 45, presenting with acute appendicitis. No complications expected. "Did you hear about the construction accident downtown yesterday?" Jackie asked as she helped Sarah with her surgical gown. 2 workers fell from the 10th floor. Both survived, thank God. Sarah felt a flutter of unease. "Thomas's site is on the east side. Thankfully, different project entirely." She pushed the thought away, focusing on the task ahead. "All right, team. Let's get Mr. Walsh prepped and ready. I've got a date with a chicken pasta tonight, and I intend to keep it." The operating room filled with light laughter, the sound bouncing off sterile walls. None of them knew it would be the last time they'd hear Dr. Chen joke before everything changed. The mint taste of Thomas's kiss still lingered on her lips, a final new memory waiting to become eternal. Michael Walsh had spent 25 years teaching students about the cosmos, but he'd never felt closer to the vast emptiness of space than he did now, lying on the operating table. The harsh operating room lights above him mimicked the stars he tracked through telescopes, cold, distant, watching with clinical detachment as human drama unfolded beneath them. "Professor Walsh, can you count backward from 10 for me?" Dr. Patel's voice floated somewhere above his head. The anesthesiologist's Indian accent reminded him of Dr. Gupta, his old colleague from the university's physics department. "Actually," Michael said, his voice already feeling thick, "I prefer counting constellations, more interesting than simple numbers." He could hear the smile in Dr. Chen's voice as she replied, though her surgical mask hid it from view. "A professor of astronomy, right? It's in your file. Her eyes crinkled above her mask, the same way his mother's used to when she performed surgery. What's your favorite constellation? Cassiopeia, he murmured, feeling the drugs begin to take hold. The queen who challenged the gods, paid the price for her pride. The ceiling lights began to blur and dance. My mother loved that one too. She was a surgeon, like you. Same eyes. He hadn't meant to mention his mother. 20 years after her death on a similar operating table, cardiac surgery gone wrong. He still carried that weight. He'd promised himself he wouldn't think about it today, wouldn't let old fears taint this necessary procedure. But there was something about being vulnerable, about the antiseptic smell and the cold air on his skin, that stripped away carefully constructed barriers. Cassiopeia, Dr. Chen repeated softly. The W in the sky. Did you know some cultures see it as a hand? Michael tried to focus on her face, but it kept shifting, overlapping with memories of his mother in her surgical gear. A hand. Yes, like yours. Steady. Mon's hands were steady too, until he felt panic rising, fighting against the sedation. Until they weren't. Professor, Dr. Chen's voice cut through the fog, authoritative but gentle. Look at my hands. She held them up in his narrowing field of vision. They were perfectly still, confident. See, steady as the North Star. I've got you. He wanted to tell her about the last surgery his mother performed, how the news of his father's car accident had reached her mid-procedure, how another surgeon had to take over, how she'd never operated again after that day. The parallels felt important somehow, like a cosmic warning he needed to share. But the drugs were winning now, turning his thoughts to stardust. The operating room became a planetarium, the medical team rotating like planets around him. Dr. Chen was Venus, he decided hazily, the brightest one, leading the others in their careful orbit. Orion's belt, he whispered, though he wasn't sure if the words actually left his lips. 3 perfect stars, like stepping stones across the sky. The monitors beeped in rhythm with his slowing thoughts. My students always start with Orion. Easiest to find. The last thing he registered was Dr. Chen's voice, steady as gravity. Beautiful place to begin, Professor. When you wake up, you'll have to tell me more about those stepping stones. As consciousness slipped away like a shooting star, Michael thought he heard someone humming. His mother's favorite song, perhaps, or just the whisper of medical machinery. He wanted to warn Dr. Chen about the fragility of perfect moments, about how the universe had a way of shattering certainty. Instead, he drifted into the darkness between stars, counting constellations until even those faded away. He didn't know that his surgical team was about to learn their own lesson about certainty, about how quickly the steadiest hands could falter where the universe decided to tilt on its axis. As he floated in his drug-induced cosmos, the real stars were aligning for a moment that would connect his story to Dr. Chen's in ways neither of them could have predicted. Every operating room has its own symphony, a delicate composition of sounds that experienced surgeons know by heart. The steady beep of the cardiac monitor provided the baseline rhythm. Michael Walsh's heart beating at a perfect 72 beats per minute. The soft hiss of mechanical ventilation added its constant undertone, while the gentle clink of surgical instruments against metal trays offered occasional percussion. Dr. Sarah Chen had performed this particular symphony hundreds of times. Forceps, she murmured, and Jackie placed them in her hand with the fluid grace of a longtime dance partner. The appendix was exactly where it should be, angry and inflamed, but uncomplicated. A textbook case. Blood pressure steady at 120/80. Dr. Patel reported from behind his array of monitors. Oxygen saturation 99%. Sarah nodded, her movements precise and measured. She was just beginning the delicate process of separating the appendix when she heard it, rapid footsteps in the corridor outside. Different from the usual busy hospital traffic, these carried urgency, purpose. Wrong notes in her perfect composition. The operating room door burst open. The sudden rush of air made the surgical drakes flutter like startled birds. Head nurse Marina Rossi stood in the doorway, her face pale beneath her mask. In her hand was Sarah's iPhone, its screen glowing with notifications. Dr. Chen, Marina's voice cracked. In 15 years of nursing, She'd never broken protocol like this. There's been an accident. At the Metropolitan Tower construction site, the forceps trembled almost imperceptibly in Sarah's hand. Marina, I'm in the middle of. It's Thomas. Time fractured into crystalline moments, sharp enough to draw blood. Sarah became acutely aware of every sensation. The slight scratch of her surgical mask against her cheek, the cool sweat gathering beneath her gown, the weight of the instruments in her suddenly leaden hands. How bad? The words felt like glass in her throat. Marina's eyes brimmed with tears. The support beam. They're saying it was instant. He saved 2 others. But the scalpel slipped from Sarah's fingers. She watched it fall, wondering absently if this was how Thomas had felt in that final moment. Suspended between one heartbeat and the next, between life and after. The instrument spun through the air, catching the operating room lights like a falling star. When it hit the floor, the clatter echoed like thunder in the suddenly silent room. Dr. Chen. Jackie's voice seemed to come from very far away. The patient. Sarah looked down at her hands, still hovering over Michael Walsh's open abdomen. They were steady. Wasn't that strange? Her world was collapsing, but her surgeon's hands remained steady. Just like her mother-in-law had once said, a surgeon's hands only shake after the crisis, never during. Aye. The word dissolved in her mouth like sugar in rain. She could smell mint toothpaste. Why could she smell mint? Thomas. The kiss. This morning. The last. Get Dr. Rodriguez. Jackie commanded someone, anyone. Now. Sarah stepped back from the table. 1 step. 2. Her boots left bloody prints on the pristine floor. When had that happened? The symphony of the operating room had transformed into cacophony. Alarms beeping, voices rising, the rush of blood in her ears, drowning out everything else. Sarah. Marina reached for her, but Sarah was already moving, pulling off her surgical gloves like she was shedding her own skin. The door seemed miles away. The hallway beyond it stretched into infinity. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear running feet, presumably Dr. Rodriguez racing to take over the surgery she was abandoning. Just before she pushed through the doors, Sarah looked back. Michael Walsh lay unconscious, unaware that he had become a footnote in someone else's tragedy. Above him, the operating room lights continued to shine, cold and bright as stars, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath their steady gaze. The doors swung shut behind her with a soft final click, like the period at the end of a sentence she couldn't take back. Sarah sat in her Volvo, still wearing blood-stained scrubs, staring at her hands gripping the steering wheel. The afternoon sun caught the dried blood beneath her fingernails, turning it almost black. Thomas had always teased her about her meticulous hand-washing routine after surgeries, like Lady Macbeth with better soap. He'd joke. Now, for the first time in her career, she hadn't cleaned up after a procedure. The GPS screen blinked patiently. Metropolitan Tower construction site. 16 minutes. She typed in the address mechanically, but her foot wouldn't move to the pedal. Through the windshield, she could see the hospital chapel's stained glass windows. 30 seconds away, the colors reminded her of the drawings Thomas had shown her last week, the architectural plans for the tower's decorative windows. Her phone buzzed again. 27 missed calls now. The hospital board would be assembling, their faces grave around the mahogany table where she'd received her department head position 2 years ago. Dr. Rodriguez would be finishing up with Michael Walsh, cleaning up her abandoned surgery with practiced efficiency. She wondered if his hands were steadier than hers had been. Dr. Chen. A knock on her car window made her flinch. Jackie stood there, still in her surgical scrubs, concern etched deep in her features. The police are here. They need someone to identify. Sarah's hand moved to the window control, then stopped. If she rolled down the window, reality would flood in. Here in her car, sealed off from the world, Thomas could still be alive. Schrödinger's husband. Both dead and alive until she opened the box. Sarah. Jackie's voice was muffled through the glass. You can't sit here forever. But why couldn't she? The car still held traces of Thomas, his coffee cup from yesterday's morning commute, a Hardet in the backseat, his favorite Beatles CD in the player. The mint taste of his kiss had faded, but she could still smell his shampoo on her scrub cap. Her surgical badge caught the sunlight, throwing a prism of colors across the dashboard. Dr. Sarah Chen, Chief of General Surgery. The title felt like fiction now. Chief surgeons don't abandon patients mid-procedure. They don't leave bloody footprints down sterile corridors. They don't sit in parking lots while their world burns. The chapel bell tolled once, the sound rippling through her like a stone dropped in still water. 1 o'clock. Thomas always texted her at 1, without fail. Still alive. He'd write, usually with a ridiculous emoji. She found herself reaching for her phone, muscle memory refusing to accept the new reality. Instead of Thomas's daily text, she found a message from the hospital administrator. Emergency board meeting, 3 p.m. Attendance mandatory. Below that, a text from an unknown number. Dr. Chen, this is Joey Martinez. I was with Thomas when, please call me, please. Her hands began to shake then, a tremor that started in her fingertips and spread up her arms like poison ivy. The steering wheel blurred as tears finally came, hot and relentless. They fell on her hands, mixing with dried blood and antiseptic, creating pale pink rivers across her skin. Through the blur, she saw more people gathering outside her car, hospital security, police officers, concerned colleagues. A small crowd of witnesses to her unraveling. The chapel beckoned, offering sanctuary. The GPS quietly recalculated. Metropolitan Tower construction site. 15 minutes. Somewhere in the hospital, Michael Walsh was being closed up by another surgeon's hands, his body oblivious to its role in this intersection of tragedies. Sarah reached for the ignition, her hand shaking so badly she missed twice. She didn't know which direction she would drive, toward the truth that would shatter her or the prayer that might save her. In this moment, suspended between profession and love, duty and grief, both choices felt equally impossible. The medical boardroom felt colder than any operating theater Sarah had ever worked in. 7 pairs of eyes watched her from around the polished mahogany table, their expressions ranging from sympathy to carefully masked disappointment. Dr. Eleanor Matthews, head of the board, shuffled papers with artificial precision, a nervous habit Sarah had noticed during countless meetings before. Dr. Chen, Eleanor began, her voice gentle but professional. We've reviewed the incident report from last Tuesday's interrupted procedure. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Before we continue, we'd like to express our deepest condolences for your loss. Sarah nodded mechanically, her fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table, the same table where Thomas had once picked her up for lunch, leaving dusty handprints that had driven the janitorial staff crazy. Thank you, she managed. However, Eleanor continued, the word hanging heavy in the air, we must discuss the implications of abandoning a patient mid-surgery. Before she could continue, the boardroom door opened. A young woman entered, her dark skin made paler by obvious exhaustion, wearing a construction company polo shirt that seemed too big for her frame. Behind her, a young man followed, his hands clutching a sketchbook, his eyes fixed on the floor. I apologize for interrupting, the woman said, her voice stronger than her appearance suggested. I'm Aisha Williams. This is Joey Martinez. We're the ones Thomas Chen saved. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't part of the scheduled proceedings. Sarah felt her heart stutter. She hadn't been ready to meet them, hadn't prepared herself for this collision of worlds. Ms. Williams, Mr. Martinez, Eleanor started. While we appreciate, Thomas was teaching me about load-bearing walls that morning. Aisha pressed on, pulling out her phone. I have videos. He was so excited about my interest in project management. Said the industry needed more women who could read a blueprint better than the men. She placed her phone on the table, sliding it toward Sarah. The screen showed Thomas gesturing animatedly at a steel beam, his face lit up with that familiar enthusiasm that made even the most mundane topics fascinating. The timestamp showed 9:47 a.m., less than 3 hours before. Joey finally looked up, opening his sketchbook with trembling hands. He still hadn't spoken, not since the accident, but his drawings spoke volumes. Page after page of Thomas in motion, pointing at architectural details, laughing with the crew, demonstrating proper safety harness technique. The sketches captured his essence with uncanny accuracy. The way his eyebrows furrowed when concentrating, how his hands never stopped moving when he explained something. He heard the crack first, Aisha said, her voice breaking slightly. The support beam wasn't properly secured. Someone's mistake. They're still investigating whose. But Thomas, he just moved. No hesitation. Pushed us both out of the way like it was instinct. Joey turned to a fresh page in his sketchbook, revealing a drawing Sarah hadn't seen before. It showed Thomas in his final moment of action, arms outstretched, face set in determined focus. He'd captured the exact angle of Thomas's hands, the same angle Sarah had seen thousands of times when he reached for her across their kitchen table. The investigators said it was the fastest response they'd ever seen, Aisha continued, her eyes meeting Sarah's. They said most people's instinct is to run away from danger, but Thomas, he ran toward it, just like you do, Dr. Chen. Every time you pick up a scalpel. The parallel hit Sarah like a physical blow. She and Thomas had taken different oaths, hers to heal, his to build, but both had sworn to protect others above themselves. In that final moment, he'd been every bit the healer she was. Eleanor cleared her throat, the sound sharp in the heavy silence. This is moving, but it doesn't change the fact that a patient was endangered. I hear he lived. Joey spoke for the first time, his voice rough from disuse. The patient. Thanks to the backup surgeon. Just like we lived. Thanks to the backup beam that caught us when the first one fell. He looked directly at Sarah. Sometimes backup plans save lives. Sometimes they're part of the design. The Starlight Coffee Shop sat on the corner of Main and Cedar, its large windows collecting afternoon light like a cat basking in the sun. Sarah almost missed Michael Walsh sitting in the corner. He looked different, vertical, hunchous, wearing a brown tweed jacket that screamed professor louder than any classroom lecture. He had a leather messenger bag beside him, worn at the edges like old constellations. Dr. Chen, he called out, raising a hand in greeting. His voice carried no anger, which somehow made this harder. Sarah had prepared for rage, rehearsed responses to accusations. Kindness was a weapon she hadn't armed herself against. Professor Walsh, she replied, her feet carrying her to his table on autopilot. 2 cups of coffee already waited, one black, one with cream. He'd remembered her preference from their pre-surgery consultation, a detail that made her stomach clench. I've been writing you letters, he said without preamble, reaching into his messenger bag. Never sent them, of course. Wasn't sure where to send them, actually. The hospital said you were on leave. He pulled out a stack of envelopes, each one dated meticulously in the upper right corner. One for every night since, since. Sarah stared at the letters. There must have been 30 or 40 of them, each envelope slightly worn, as if they'd been handled repeatedly. I don't understand. Neither did I at first. Michael smiled softly. I'd wake up at 3 a.m., my incision hurting. It's healing nicely. By the way, Dr. Rodriguez did good work, and I'd find myself writing to you. Not out of anger, though God knows I tried to be angry. It was something else. He pushed the stack toward her. The top envelope read simply, to the surgeon who taught me about falling stars. I wanted to hate you, he continued, wrapping his hands around his coffee cup. It would have been easier, wouldn't it, to make you the villain in my story, the doctor who abandoned me, who left me cut open on a table while another surgeon had to step in. But then I remembered something about my mother. Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up the first letter. Your mother, the surgeon who dropped her instruments when she heard about my father's car crash. Michael's words fell like stones in still water. I never told you the end of that story, did I? The drugs kicked in before I could finish. She never operated again after that day. The guilt ate at her until there was nothing left. She died thinking she'd failed her patient, her profession. Did she? Sarah barely whispered. Fail them. The patient lived, just like I lived. But my mother. He paused, taking a careful sip of coffee. She couldn't live with her choice. That's why I started writing these letters. Because I finally understood something she never did. that sometimes the most human thing we can do is break when we're supposed to be strong. A barista dropped something in the kitchen, the crash making them both jump. Sarah noticed her hand had moved unconsciously to a surgical scar from her own appendectomy 15 years ago. I broke more than protocol that day. You broke exactly as much as you needed to, Michael replied, pushing another envelope toward her. This one you should read first. It's about the night I realized why I couldn't hate you. I was looking at Cassiopeia through my telescope. Remember how I mentioned it before surgery? And I realized something about broken things. Sarah opened the envelope with unsteady fingers, the paper crinkling like autumn leaves. As she began to read, Michael's handwriting swam before her eyes. Dear Dr. Chen, tonight I understood that some stars only look broken from Earth. From a different angle, they form perfect patterns. Maybe that's true of broken people too. Dr. Nisha Kumar's office felt more like a greenhouse than a therapist's workspace. Potted plants lined every windowsill, their leaves reaching toward the afternoon light like patient hands. Sarah sat in what had become her usual spot, a worn leather armchair with a clear view of the door, an escape route she hadn't used yet but couldn't help monitoring. You brought the grape, Dr. Kumar noted, gesturing to the fruit Sarah held. It was their 4th session, and Sarah's 12th grape. The first 11 lay destroyed in the wastepaper basket, their skins torn and pulp crushed. I've been practicing at home, Sarah admitted, rolling the purple globe between her fingers. Used a whole bag yesterday. My kitchen counter looks like a winemaking accident. Dr. Kumar smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of her eyes. And how many successful surgeries did you perform on those grapes? None. Sarah placed the grape on the small surgical tray between them. The metal gleamed under the office lights, making her think of operating rooms, of scalpels falling, of choices that couldn't be unmade. My hands still shake. Show me. Sarah picked up the tiny scalpel, more like a craft knife, really, but it felt enormous in her suddenly unsteady grip. The grape sat there, purple and pristine, waiting for her to fail again. Tell me about Thomas's hands, Dr. Kumar said quietly. The question caught Sarah off guard. What? His hands? You were a surgeon, he was a builder. Both of you worked with your hands. Tell me about his. Sarah closed her eyes, the grape momentarily forgotten. They were always rough, no matter how much lotion he used. They stayed calloused. He used to joke that between his construction calluses and my surgical scars, we had the most interesting handhold in Boston. And were his hands always steady? A memory surfaced. Thomas attempting to frost their anniversary cake, his hands shaking with concentration. No. Sarah laughed softly. God, no. He couldn't thread a needle to save his life. But when it mattered, she thought of Aisha's story, of how steady those rough hands had been in their final act of saving. The grape isn't a patient, Sarah, Dr. Kumar said gently. Just like that scalpel isn't really a scalpel. They're stand-ins, metaphors. We're not actually testing your surgical skills here. Then what are we testing? Your willingness to break. Sarah looked up sharply. Dr. Kumar continued, you've spent your entire career being unbreakable. Perfect control, steady hands, zero mistakes. But that's not actually what makes a great surgeon, is it? The grape seemed to pulse in Sarah's peripheral vision. What does then? Knowing when to break. Knowing that sometimes being human matters more than being perfect. Dr. Kumar leaned forward. Tell me about Michael Walsh's letters again. Sarah's hand moved to her bag, where she kept the latest letter. She'd read one each day, rationing them like precious medicine. He writes about stars a lot, about how some constellations only make sense when you're looking from the right angle. And what angle are you looking from now? Sarah picked up the scalpel again. This time, instead of trying to remove the great skin in one perfect piece, she simply cut it in half. Purple juice stained her fingers. A different one. Dr. Kumar nodded approvingly. Sometimes destroying something shows us more than preserving it ever could. Later that week, Sarah stood before her first group of medical students. Their eager faces reminded her of the grape, ripe with potential, waiting to be shaped or broken or both. Today, she began, holding up her slightly trembling hands. We're going to talk about what they don't teach you in medical school, about the day your hands might shake, and why that doesn't make you any less of a healer. 1 year, 3 months, and 17 days after the scalpel fell, Sarah Chen stood outside operating room 4, her hands steady around a cup of mint tea. She'd switched from coffee. The taste reminded her too much of morning kisses and last words. Through the small window, she could see her team preparing for today's surgery, a delicate procedure on James Chen, no relation, a 74-year-old violinist with hands gnarled by rheumatoid arthritis. Dr. Chen. Jackie appeared beside her, older now in subtle ways. They all were. The observation gallery is full. Sarah nodded, unsurprised. Word had spread about her return to surgery, drawing a crowd of witnesses. She knew who would be there. Michael Walsh, still writing his letters, though they'd become more like friendship's correspondence now. Aisha Williams, who'd finished her project management certification and brought Thomas's vision of the Metropolitan Tower to completion. Joey Martins, whose sketches of Thomas now hung in the hospital's memorial gallery. His hands are like Thomas's, Sarah said quietly, watching her elderly patient through the window. When I examined them yesterday, all those calluses from years of violin strings. Working hands. Jackie touched her arm gently. Are you ready? Sarah took a final sip of tea, letting the mint wash away old ghosts. I've been practicing on grapes, she said with a small smile. Jackie, who'd witnessed dozens of destroyed fruits over the past year, squeezed her shoulder in understanding. Inside the operating room, the familiar symphony began. Monitors beeping, oxygen flowing, instruments clinking. But now Sarah heard the music differently, not as a demand for perfection, but as a collaboration of human elements, each beautiful in its imperfection. Good morning, Mr. Chen, she said, her voice clear behind her surgical mask. Still want to play Tchaikovsky's violin concerto at your granddaughter's wedding? The elderly violinist's eyes crinkled above his oxygen mask. That's the dream, Dr. Chen. 6 months from today. Then let's make it happen. She held up her hands in the bright operating lights, showing her team. They were steady, but not with the rigid steadiness of her past. This was a different kind of strength, one that acknowledged its own fragility. In the observation gallery above, Michael Walsh leaned forward in his seat. He'd brought a telescope with him, the same one he used to track Cassiopeia across the night sky. Beside him, Aisha unrolled the final blueprints of Metropolitan Tower, completed exactly as Thomas had envisioned. Joey opened his sketchbook to a fresh page, ready to capture this moment of renewal. Sarah made the first incision, precise and purposeful. No scalpels fell, no worlds ended. Instead, something new began, in the way her hands moved with both skill and humanity, in the way she guided her team through each step, acknowledging both the science and the soul of their work. Look at her hands, someone whispered in the gallery, steady as stars. But Sarah knew better now. Stars weren't steady at all. They pulsed, they flickered, they lived and died in spectacular displays of both strength and surrender. Thomas had taught her that in his final moment of choice. Michael had reminded her through his letters. Dr. Kumar had shown her with simple grapes. Hours later, as she finished the final suture on James Chen's restored hands, Sarah felt Thomas's presence. Not as a ghost of grief, but as a foundation of understanding. They had both chosen paths that required sacrifice, that demanded they hold others' futures in their hands. The difference now was that she understood what he'd known in his last breath, that sometimes the steadiest hands are the ones that know when to tremble. Beautiful work, Dr. Chen, Jackie said softly as they began closing. Sarah looked up at the gallery where her unlikely family of witnesses sat, then down at her patient's hands, hands that would create music again, because she had learned to break and heal in equal measure. Yes, she agreed, thinking of mint toothpaste and falling scalpels, of grapes and letters and constellations that only made sense when viewed from the scars they left behind. Beautiful indeed.